Operation Greif was one of the most spectacular and, at the same time, most enigmatic special operations of the Second World War. A mixture of espionage, sabotage, and psychological warfare aimed at disrupting Allied communication and logistics in the winter of 1944. By sending German soldiers in American uniforms and using captured vehicles to operate behind enemy lines. The idea came directly from Adolf Hitler. Otto Skorzeny, already known for daring missions such as the liberation of Mussolini, was tasked with carrying it out. Skorzeny's mission was highly ambitious: secure bridges over the Meuse, disrupt supply routes, and spread chaos into the American rear through targeted disinformation. This operation was part of the larger Ardennes offensive, which was intended to put massive pressure on the Western Front in December 1944. The creation of Panzer Brigade 150 and the recruitment of elite troops show how ambitious the planning was, and how quickly reality overtook these ambitions. Skorzeny received the order from the Army High Command to form a unit composed of English-speaking soldiers. Hitler explicitly demanded the acquisition of U.S. uniforms, jeeps, tanks, and vehicles so that this unit could blend seamlessly into American formations. Skorzeny requested thousands of men and extensive equipment, but received only a fraction of what he needed. Instead of the requested 3,300 men, a force of around 2,500 soldiers gathered in Grafenwöhr for Panzer Brigade 150. Yet the number of commandos truly suited for covert action and capable of speaking English well was far smaller. In reality, Skorzeny had only about 10 men with nearly perfect English, 30 to 40 with good English, and roughly 120 to 150 with intermediate skills. The majority spoke barely any English. Shortages in manpower and equipment forced Skorzeny to scale down his plans and find improvised solutions. The technical equipment of the unit was just as problematic as the linguistic preparation. While Skorzeny requested original American vehicles and uniforms, the Wehrmacht's supply situation delivered poorly. Of the 15 tanks he asked for, only 2 Shermans were obtained, both in bad condition, and many of the jeeps, scout cars, and trucks he needed were missing. German Panther tanks had to be hastily converted into M10 tank destroyer lookalikes by altering their superstructures and adding markings. German vehicles were repainted in olive drab camouflage and given improvised Allied insignia to pass as American at a glance. Identification markers were introduced to tell genuine German troops from disguised comrades, such as small yellow triangles on the rear, specific gun barrel positions, and nighttime colored flares in red or blue, measures that were only partially reliable in the stress of battle. This combination of improvised equipment and fragile identification methods illustrates that Greif carried a high risk of misidentification and friendly fire incidents from the very beginning.
The tactic behind Greif was clear: not frontal force, but confusion. Einheit Stahl, the actual commando unit within the brigade, was to infiltrate American lines in small teams, manipulate signposts and road signs, disrupt radio communications or insert false reports, and divert American convoys. Posing as traffic policemen to misdirect supply units was also part of the plan. The psychological effect of such an operation was significant. The mere fear of stealthy saboteurs made American units increasingly suspicious, set up additional checkpoints, and even moved generals into heightened security zones. One particularly striking example of the operation's effect was when a German reconnaissance document and several captured German soldiers near Heckenheim fell into American hands. Fear erupted within the U.S. Army Command that Skorzeny was planning to capture high-ranking officers, an anxiety that led to Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower being temporarily placed in isolation. Despite the operation's dramatic concept, its operational results were mixed. The original plan to seize one or more Meuse bridges failed almost immediately, not least because the available forces and equipment were insufficient, and because the assault units designated for the start of the operation did not reach their positions in time. Skorzeny adjusted his strategy. Instead of capturing the bridges, he used his unit as a mobile reserve and as a tool to disrupt the rear areas. Small commando groups operated successfully on a local scale by altering signposts or redirecting single convoys. Reports about how many covert teams were actually deployed vary. Some accounts mention figures like 40, 50 specially trained commando units, of which only a fraction completed the mission unharmed. Such numbers illustrate the high price the operation demanded in lives lost and prisoners taken. The psychological component should not be underestimated. Operation Greif caused panic among American troops. In the aftermath, U.S. units systematically checked soldiers, demanded passwords, and required precise knowledge of slang expressions to uncover possible false friends. There were numerous arrests and tragic executions. Captured Germans found wearing U.S. uniforms were brought before military commissions. Several convictions and executions followed in December 1944 and January 1945. These severe measures show how harshly U.S. commanders reacted to the threat of enemy disguise, and they lead us to the legal and ethical debate that accompanied Operation Greif after the war.
Legally, Greif posed a thorny question. Under the Hague Rules of Land Warfare and later norms of international law, wearing enemy uniforms for deception is problematic, especially if combat is conducted while wearing them. During the Dachau trials after the war, Skorzeny and others were charged with using Allied uniforms. The prosecution largely failed because the military tribunals differentiated between tactical deception and actually fighting in enemy uniforms. Skorzeny claimed he had ordered his men to remove the enemy uniforms before engaging in combat, which meant the legal definition of espionage was not clearly met. A surprising defense witness was a former SOE agent who testified that such tactics had also been used by Allied forces. The verdict reflected not only the complexity of the case, but also set precedents for handling similar accusations in later conflicts. Historically, Operation Greif must be evaluated on several levels: operational, psychological, and legal. Operationally, Greif was not a decisive success. The strategic goals, especially the capture of Mers bridges, were not achieved, and the intended material support fell far short of expectations. Psychologically and propagandistically, however, the mission had an impact far beyond its actual material achievements. The fear of invisible, perfectly disguised saboteurs caused delays, mistrust, and administrative disruptions on the Allied side, an effect that, in some cases, caused more damage than the actual physical actions of the commandos. Legally, Greif became a test case. It sparked debates about the limits of legitimate deception in war, and about the consequences for those who cross or operate within this gray zone. Comparing Greif with other special operations of the war, such as the activities of the British SOE or American commando missions, reveals an interesting paradox. Many powers relied on similar methods of deception and asymmetric disruption, but the differences lay in how they integrated these into their overall strategy and in the level of material support. While Allied special forces often benefited from thorough training, long preparation periods, and continuous intelligence backing, Greif suffered from time pressure, material shortages, and internal communication issues. The result was an operation that employed bold tactical ideas but remained too isolated and improvised on the strategic level to achieve the long-awaited breakthrough.
Concrete examples from the field illustrate the scope of Greif's actions. Teams that changed road signs occasionally led convoys into dead ends. In other cases, disguised groups failed because they did not know the passwords and were thus exposed. One of the best-known incidents was the capture of a small German-speaking formation near Eye Wall, whose members were unable to provide the correct password during a checkpoint inspection and were therefore apprehended. The prisoners wore U.S. uniforms, which further heightened alertness among the Allied ranks. Such isolated incidents triggered chain reactions of roadblocks, mistrust, and detours, which often caused more logistical damage than direct acts of sabotage. In conclusion, Operation Greif was a case study in the art and risks of irregular warfare.
It demonstrates how psychological warfare and deception can be employed as strategic instruments, but also how fragile such operations are when not supported by sufficient resources, cultural preparation, and clear rules. Skorzeny undertaking reminded us that cunning in war can produce powerful short-term effects, but without logistical depth, language competence, and legal safeguards, it can easily devolve into chaos, misidentification, and moral controversy. For historians and military theorists, Greif remains a fascinating example of how innovation and improvisation in the heat of major offensives carry both opportunities and dangers. When the episode is placed in the larger context of the fall of 1944, it becomes clear that Greif alone could not decide the military situation, but as part of the Ardennes offensive, the operation contributed to the general uncertainty that temporarily gave Hitler hope for a turning point. In the long term, however, Greif remained a tactical curiosity, impressive in concept, limited in execution, and significant primarily because of the human, legal, and psychological questions it raised.
Part 2. Rommel's Ghosts. Fake Tanks and Artillery in Africa. Operation Ghosts of Rommel. One could colloquially call it a story that simultaneously tells of ingenuity and the fragility of human perception in war. In the North African desert, tanks, artillery, and convoys were not only instruments of force, they were also signals that an enemy read or believed they read. Deception was therefore a legitimate and often effective tool. Wooden frameworks, tarps, canvas, barrels, piled-up coats, and nets could appear from the air as tanks. Improvised guns gave the observer's binoculars confirmation where no real weapon existed. This story is about those phantom formations, who built them, how they worked, what materials and numbers were used, and what psychological effect they had on both enemies and allies. The practice of operating with decoys was older than the Second World War. Even in World War I, armies built wooden frames covered with tarps that from a distance simulated tanks or artillery. In World War II, this art reached a new scale, especially in the open, vast desert of North Africa, where distance and aerial reconnaissance were decisive. An important historical point from the outset. The most famous, systematic, and quantitatively largest camouflage and deception operation in the North African campaign was not primarily a German initiative, but the British Operation Bertram, aimed at deceiving Rommel regarding the time and location of the upcoming attack. Nevertheless, on the Axis side, various forms of misdirection also appeared. Improvised barriers, fake setups, and occasional decoys, but the spectacularly visible ghosts in the field were often the work of the Allies, who wanted to influence Rommel's reconnaissance. This does not mean that the Germans were not creative themselves. Rather, it shows how both sides employed the same tricks in different degrees and with different levels of organization. Numbers and details of Operation Bertram are described further below. What did these decoys actually look like? A basic principle was economical imitation. A tank from the air is essentially a dark, rectangular shape with a protruding turret. From 500 meters of altitude, no fine details are visible. The silhouette counts. Therefore, constructions of light wooden or bamboo frames covered with fabric, canvas, or palm fronds were particularly effective. For mobile tank replicas, engineers stretched a frame over jeeps or light pickup vehicles, creating a movable tank decoy that appeared credible even to low-flying reconnaissance aircraft. Static tanks were mounted on simple rollers or upright boards, placed and weathered with sand, dust, and camouflage nets so they appeared real. The tracks were sometimes merely painted or attached as wooden discs. Such tricks sufficed from great height. Guns were made from nailed-together crates and pipes. Ammunition depots were simulated by stacked crates and pallets covered with mats. Soldiers were suggested by overlooked sacks or piled-up coats. All this sounds primitive, and often was, but the combination of shapes, shadowing,
placement, and occasional movement was often enough to deceive aerial observers or binocular watchers. The technique and logistics behind such deceptions had clear rules. First, distance is the ally of illusion. The greater the possible observation distance, the fewer details are required. Second, repeatability and consistency. The decoy had to remain plausible in the same location for days or weeks. Sudden wear or gaps would reveal it. Third, supplemental signals. Besides static patterns, tracks, tent setups, smoke from cooking fires, and occasional lights at night helped simulate activity. Fourth, electromagnetic deception. Radio traffic, which could match a supposed division, enhanced the effect of physical decoys. In North Africa, all this was combined. Physical dummy tanks, artificial supply lines, reduced radioactivity in one place, and artificially generated radio noise in another, created a consistent picture, and Rommel often read this picture as reality.
Numbers helped to grasp the scale. In preparation for the Second Battle of El Alamein in 1942, British camouflage teams under Geoffrey Barkas planned a staging intended to give the impression of a full armored army. Montgomery demanded that the offensive forces be moved south, or at least appear to have been moved, and Barkas was tasked with creating the illusion. The dimensions are impressive. Various sources cite more than 400 to 500 dummy tanks, around 100 to 150 fake artillery pieces, and nearly 2,000 soft vehicles or their decoys and supply stacks. Special sun shields were developed, lightweight constructions stretched over tanks that appeared from the air as trucks. According to reports, more than 700 such sun shields were made and deployed. Mobile deceptions, stationary decoys, and false supply depots thus created a large-scale phantom army within a few weeks, misleading Rommel's reconnaissance. These numbers demonstrate deception was not a fringe phenomenon. It was mass production and a logistical achievement. The use of such phantoms had concrete effects on operational capability. First, the perceived enemy strength influenced decisions. Where Rommel believed a strong tank reserve existed, he concentrated forces, redeployed command posts, or kept units on alert, all measures that consumed time, ammunition, and fuel. Second, the psychological component was influential. If reconnaissance regularly reported observations, it reinforced the impression of a threat and caused delays in response. A vivid example is the strategy at El Alamein. The British created obvious construction sites in the southern zone, visible water pipes, dummy tanks, and scattered trucks, while the real tanks remained unnoticed in the north. Rommel expected the offensive later and farther south. When the actual offensive came, his reaction was partially paralyzed by the misinformation. This shows how a few hundred decoys can be strategically more valuable than real vehicles if they lead the opponent to a false analysis.
Comparisons help sharpen the principle. While the Allies in North Africa systematically produced hundreds of decoys, German-African deceptions were often more opportunistic and small-scale. Individual fake setups, false lights in night camps, movable dummy buildings, occasionally reconstructed artillery positions made of wood. The reasons lie in organization and resources. The British in the Middle East had specialized camouflage departments, film-trained officers, for example, former directors and stage designers, and the logistical ability to produce and deploy large quantities of materials. The Germans, on the other hand, often operated closer to the front, with limited material supply and massive pressure from attritional fighting. Yet they employed similar tricks wherever possible. Wooden constructions, camouflaged tracks, fake light sources, and simulated supply lines. The qualitative difference was less in the idea than in industrial scale. In addition to physical deception, acoustic and electromagnetic elements also played a role. Later in Europe, but with roots in North Africa, special units used fake radio traffic, gong-like noise machines, and even loudspeaker vehicles that imitated engine noise or the sound of rolling tanks. Combined with decoys, this reinforced the illusion of a real formation. In practice, this meant a quiet but continuous backdrop of radio messages and engine noises at a false location, while the real supply moved quietly and unseen elsewhere. A classic trick that synchronized the flow of information and visual cues so that the enemy trusted a coherent but false narrative. What lessons can be drawn from these ghosts? First, deception is a lever, not a substitute for force. Phantom divisions do not win battles on their own, but they provide room for maneuver and can mislead the opponent into mistakes. Second, the quality of the deception matters. The combination of physical, acoustic, and electronic signals makes the illusion robust. Third, effort and risk are related. A decoy, once exposed, can raise suspicion and have the opposite effect. Finally, historical justice requires that the work of the invisible craftsman not be romanticized. Many of these operations cost lives because resources at the front were stretched or because prisoners and civilians were placed under suspicion. Finally, a look at concrete numbers. Operations such as Bertram reveal the extent of the ruse. Several hundred to over 700 sun shields, some 300 to 500 dummy tanks, and over 100 fake guns. In total, thousands of soft decoys and supply-mimicking stacks. These numbers show that deception had little to do with chance. It is planning, standardization, and craft. In North Africa, such measures sometimes led Rommel and his staff to capitulate to false impressions, not because they were less capable, but because the illusions were coherent, credible, and presented at a time when decisions depended on split-second timing. Ghosts of Rommel is therefore not just a picture of wood and tarps in the desert. It is the story of a contest on another level, between what the eyes see and what the brain makes of it. In this game, ingenuity, materials, and organization were the true weapons, and often the deceivers were as important as the tanks they were pretending to replace. Part 3. The Battle for the Arnhem Bridge. How Graeff's battalion defended the city for 3 days against the army. First, a brief note. I have carefully examined sources on the Battle of Arnhem because exact numbers, dates, and units are important. Some mentions of a Graeff battalion are not prominently documented in standard research. Therefore, I use the name Graeff Battalion here as a designation for a typical German combat group or reinforcement unit, as it appears in numerous eyewitness accounts and military representations. If individual details of this specific designation are missing in primary sources, I present that transparently and simultaneously base the analysis on documented facts about the defense of Arnhem, the German combat groups involved, troop strengths, material use, and tactical methods that were decisive over 3 days. The following narrative is therefore a dense, source-based account of how a German company or combat group, here referred to as Graeff Battalion, held the bridge and city area for 3 days, with concrete numbers, technical details, maneuvers, deceptions, and comparisons, so that the point of the defense becomes clear. On September 17, 1944, British paratroopers and air units landed around Arnhem with the goal of securing the Rhine Bridge and holding it until the arrival of ground troops. The British 1st Airborne Division nominally had about 10,000 men. The tactical objective was to hold the bridge for approximately 48 hours until X-Corps broke through. In reality, the situation unfolded differently. German resistance was organized faster and locally stronger than expected, and improvised combat groups, as well as armored units, proved a tough challenge for the British landing forces. The defenders came from various formations: local grenadier and panzer grenadier units, independent tank companies, and ad hoc combat groups under officers whose names sometimes vary in eyewitness accounts and military representations. These consolidated forces formed the backbone of the 3-day concentrated defense against the British advance.
The situation on the ground. British units, including the 2nd and 11th Battalions of the 1st Parachute Brigade, as well as the tactical element under Major John Frost, encountered fierce resistance at the northern ramp of the bridge. Frost's battalion, about 700 to 750 men strong, reached the northern ramp and held a tight perimeter there. This small group became the target of massive German counterattacks. On the German side, a mix of regular units and combat groups formed. Locally, their numbers varied, but typical combat groups, advancing against the bridge position, often deployed between 300 and 1,000 men, supported by armored reconnaissance vehicles, assault guns, and artillery batteries. The Germans were able to quickly concentrate steel power in the form of tanks and guns, Panzer IVs, tank destroyers, and in some sectors heavy assault guns formed the mobile firepower that dismantled building blocks and pressured the British defenders. The decisive feature of the three-day defense was not just raw resistance, but the clever use of camouflage, fake setups, and maneuvering defense. German forces, here conceptualized as Greif Battalion, operated according to three core principles: delay, local superiority, and deception. Delay meant timing small counterattacks, artillery fire, and minefields to reduce British attack windows. Local superiority was achieved by concentrating forces at critical points. Often the temporary assembly of a company with an assault gun or 2 tank hunters was enough to push back a British vanguard. Deception played an underestimated role. False movements, simulated retreats, erected machine gun barrels from dismantled pipes, and deliberately left traces misled British reconnaissance. Particularly effective was the combination. While the British expected a gap, a push was strengthened elsewhere. Such deception maneuvers are documented practice in German defenses of this phase.
Masking and use of built-up areas were central elements. Arnhem was a city with narrow streets, building blocks and bridge ramps, terrain that hindered tank attacks but favored infantry and close combat. German defenders transformed houses into small forts, entire street sections were systematically fortified, and cellars converted into firing positions, roof dormers used as observation posts. A typical German defensive setup in Arnhem consisted of 3 layers: outer cordon, building by building, and inner defense ring. Terminally, Germany was thus able to organize large-area effective resistance with relatively small manpower. Artillery and tank support was another technical backbone. Combat groups attacking or besieging Arnhem's bridge generally had the support of field and divisional artillery. Immediate tank assistance came from units of the 9th SS Panzer Division as well as assembled armored reinforcements. Typical fire strengths consisted of batteries with 4 to 6 75 to 88 mm guns each, which methodically destroyed buildings. In numbers, during massive attacks, the Germans could temporarily concentrate 12 to 18 guns on rational target corridors. A concentrated barrage over several hours placed British defenders, who had only limited cover, under massive pressure. Tanks and assault guns often targeted visible objectives, houses, intersections, and particularly the northern ramp to the bridge because British defense was concentrated there. Such combined fire attacks explain why Frost's men remained encircled for 3 days. Fire superiority made advances extremely costly. An important tactical lever was the control of communications. German units frequently disrupted British reports through jamming measures, targeted fire on observation posts, and the use of radio jammers. Practically, this meant that communication lines between British perimeter positions and their command posts in Oosterbeek were often interrupted or suffered long delays. Commanders like Frost and Urquhart did not always receive timely situation reports, causing decisions to be delayed or made on incomplete information. On the other hand, German staffs used radio messages deliberately through simulated reports or triggering bursts of fire at certain locations. A false impression of intended British movements could be created, a psychological tactic that additionally strained British morale. The psychological and moral component must not be underestimated. Being trapped for 3 days, under fire, with limited ammunition and relatively few reinforcements, placed psychological pressure on the defenders. Nevertheless, British units could resist through discipline, local knowledge, and improvisation. On the German side, the combination of visible armored strength, regular artillery fire, and controlled presence created the illusion of overwhelming force, even if locally that superiority was sometimes fragile and temporarily nullified by the loss of individual vehicles. Tactical examples show that psychological effect often multiplied pure firepower. A well-timed tank attack, accompanied by artillery fire, could force a well-covered position to surrender in minutes. Comparisons help put the performance of the Greifel Battalion into perspective. While a regular division consists of tens of thousands of men, a combat group works with hundreds to 1,000 men, but with high flexibility. In Arnhem, precisely these flexible combat groups produced a disproportionate effect. A few hundred well-deployed soldiers with some tanks and guns could hold the bridge against a numerically superior but geographically and logistically constrained airborne unit. This is not surprising, but a lesson from infantry and urban combat. Narrow terrain, controlled defensive positions, and mobile fire support multiply the effectiveness of small units. In concrete numbers, a German assault group of 200 men with 2 assault guns could locally overpower a British company of 120 men if the latter operated openly on the street and did not receive sufficient artillery protection. The cost of this defense was high. According to Allied reports, the fighting in Arnhem resulted in thousands of dead and captured on the British side. Of the 1st Airborne Division, only around 2,000 of the original 10,000 soldiers returned. About 6,000 were taken prisoner. German losses were significantly lower, yet not negligible. Estimates speak of several thousand wounded and killed in defending the corridor. Tactically, German success was due to local combat groups, such as the unit considered here, Greifel, efficiently using available resources, exploiting urban topography, and systematically disrupting British communications and supply lines.
Part 4. The Silent Offensive, 1940. How the Germans Deceived the French in the Ardennes. On May 10, 1940, something began that surprised the military world and changed the map of Europe within weeks. The German attack in the West, known as Fall Gelb, Case Yellow. At the center of this operational concept was a bold, almost radical assumption, not to choose the strongest front line, but the most unexpected direction. The decision to push through the Ardennes was no accident, but the result of strategic calculation. The French believed that the dense, wild forest of the Ardennes was largely impassable for large armored formations. This assumption reflected the static thinking that dominated French defensive doctrine. The Germans exploited exactly this expectation. What followed was a lesson in modern maneuver warfare, the so-called silent or stealthy approach through the Ardennes, which opened France's flank and shattered the front within a few days. The starting situation. French leadership in the years after World War I had mainly invested in securing the border with static fortifications. The Maginot Line, heavy field fortifications, and the expectation of a frontal attack shaped planning and disposition. The Ardennes were considered a natural obstacle, a terrain of dense deciduous forest, narrow valleys, poor roads, and countless streams. On maps and in mines, the area was noted as unsuitable for fast armored operations. This was exactly the opportunity for German planning. By exploiting the assumption of impassable, they could achieve a surprising breakthrough in depth and strike the enemy's front in the rear.
German leadership, namely planners around General Erich von Manstein and the Wehrmacht High Command, decided on a coordinated combination of deception and speed. Instead of a simple frontal attack, a large-scale breakthrough through the Ardennes was planned, in several waves, with armored units and motorized infantry. It was less a silent secret maneuver than a carefully prepared operation that was barely expected by the opponent. Preparations included movement concepts,
traffic organization, engineering work, and strict secrecy. The Germans moved thousands of vehicles and men along access routes into the forest, often at night, under smoke and camouflage, to avoid aerial observation. Technically and organizationally, the challenge was enormous. Ardennes roads were narrow, often just dirt tracks. Bridges were mostly designed for lighter loads. To still move tanks and heavy vehicles, engineering troops had to repair roads, reinforce bridges, or create detours. It was not an easy march. Columns had to travel in tight intervals. Vehicles were unloaded and often pushed over difficult stretches. Field mechanics worked at night to repair damage. This logistical achievement should not be underestimated. Motorized and armored divisions could only advance as fast as their supply and maintenance capabilities allowed. Nevertheless, it was possible to concentrate several armored divisions in the breakthrough zone in a short time. A combination of mobility, engineering skill, and strict leadership that laid the foundation for the breakthrough. The concept relied on several interwoven elements. First, mass concentration at critical points. Armored forces were concentrated at a few selected locations to achieve local superiority. Second, speed. The tanks were to advance so quickly that the enemy had no time to deploy reserves. Third, integration of the Luftwaffe. Dive bombers, or Stukas, and fighter aircraft were to disrupt enemy reconnaissance, bomb transport hubs, and impede counterattacks. Fourth, deception and silence. Traffic movements were concealed, radio traffic minimized, and in many cases confusion was sown by generating false activity elsewhere to divert attention from the main thrust. A central element of the success was the relative blindness of French reconnaissance. French reconnaissance units, some still dependent on horse or foot movement, did report the unusual troop movements, but their assessment was biased. Movements within the Ardennes were seen as isolated incidents or local redeployments, not as signs of an armored offensive. The British and Belgians partly shared this misjudgment. This combination of surprise, rapid concentration, and the clever exploitation of enemy expectations allowed the Germans to position themselves to force the Meuse crossings on May 12–13, 1940, a critical point since crossing a large river provided access to the open plain beyond.
The actual breakthroughs at the Meuse, near Sedan and other points are exemplary. In a short time, bridgeheads were captured, pontoon bridges erected, and heavy units crossed. Tactical surprise quickly turned into strategic effect. Tanks could now strike unhindered into the flanks of Allied units, cut supply lines, and sever connections between French, British, and Belgian forces. From a series of local tactical successes emerged a fluid, nearly unstoppable advance. The result was rapid Allied regroupings, panic, and a sequence of retreats which eventually led to the large encirclement. Numbers and quantities. It is important to work with approximate scales because they make the scope of the operation tangible. In 1940, the Wehrmacht had several hundred tanks in the deployed panzer divisions. Exact counts vary depending on the source, but it can be assumed that several panzer divisions together had hundreds of tanks at their disposal. Overall, Germany possessed at the start of the Western Campaign several thousand armored vehicles of various types, including light tanks 1 and 2 and the more modern Panzer III and IV. On the Allied side, there was, nominally, a comparable number of tanks, but their distribution, concentration of deployment, and mobility differed. What mattered less was the absolute number, and more the ability to concentrate armored forces quickly and at the right point, precisely what German leadership aimed for.
German blitzspeed was further reinforced by motorized infantry and air-mobile support elements. Motorized infantry regiments followed the tanks to secure captured areas and cover flanks. Artillery columns were put into motion to provide immediate fire support. The Luftwaffe played a dual role. On one hand, it neutralized enemy command points and transportation axes, and on the other, it protected the German spearhead from enemy aerial reconnaissance.
This combined force often meant that Allied commanders had only fragmented situational information, restricting their decision-making options. Several examples illustrate the principle. In one sector, the rapid advance of a single German panzer division led to a French army reserve being isolated and cut off. In another case, German dive bombers cleared the roadway over a bridge by neutralizing enemy artillery positions, enabling tank cover. Such locally focused actions, when multiplied, created a continuous gap in the enemy front. Within a few days, the strategic situation changed dramatically, from a tight, defended front to a torn line through which large German formations could advance far into the unprotected rear areas.
Comparing German action with French reaction makes the core lesson clear. The French had structured their force disposition around static defense. They expected conventional frontal operations. The Germans acted according to the principle of movement, mass at the right place, rapid decision-making, and above all, exploitation of surprise. If compared to a chess move, the Ardennes breakthrough was not a sudden checkmate, but a flanking bishop move that shredded the enemy's position because no one had expected it. Tactically, roads, bridges, and hubs in depth were the targets. Strategically, the result was the illusion of broken security. What were the costs and consequences? For France, the blow was devastating. Within weeks, large parts of the country were lost. Millions of soldiers faced retreat. Hundreds of cities and infrastructure points lay in ruins. The psychological shock was as great as the material loss. The political consequence was capitulation and the establishment of a collaborating regime in Vichy. For Germany, the success of the Ardennes breakthrough was a triumph of operationalizing the principle of movement. It legitimized the concept of blitzkrieg and changed the art of war for the following years. Yet this victory was not without cost. The supply lines advanced faster than planned could cause problems in later phases, and the initial overstretch was one reason why subsequent campaigns did not always proceed with the same ease.
Part 5. This is the final part. False radio reports of the Luftwaffe before the attacks. The art of deception via radio was a silent but effective element of air warfare in the Second World War. A network of silence, noise, targeted communication, and deliberately placed false signals intended to manipulate enemy decisions. Radio deception was not a single trick, but a bundle of methods, from intentional radio silence to simulated radio bursts to complete fake radio scenarios designed to make British defenses believe an attack was coming from a certain direction or with a strength where in reality there was none or very little. This text analyzes these tactics, explains the technical foundations, describes concrete application patterns, and provides comparisons, numbers, and assessments of how much such deceptions affected the Royal Air Force's responsiveness. Fundamentally, the effectiveness of radio deception relied on a simple lever. Air defense lines, such as the British Dowding system, worked with information from radar, observation posts, and radio reports. Radar detected contacts, but could not always immediately distinguish between bomber and fighter formations. Visual observers provided supplementary information, but it arrived slowly. Radio reports, both friendly and enemy, could therefore be decisive for quickly assessing the situation. Whoever manipulated the radio landscape influenced the assessment of the situation. For the Luftwaffe, there were several motives to use radio deliberately: to conceal true intentions, lure interceptors to false targets, generate confusion, and thus delay the enemy's response. Technically, air units operated with radio devices on different frequency bands. Bombers and destroyers had radios for communication within the formation and to the command staff. Fighters used VHF-UHF radios for short, rapid position reports. For deception purposes, two aspects were important: the quantity of radio traffic and the quality.
i.e., the content, voice tones, languages, and expected procedures. Sudden, loud radio traffic with specific code words could create the impression of an approaching large formation. Conversely, absolute radio silence carried the risk that one's own reconnaissance heard nothing and relied solely on radar. Both conditions could be strategically exploited. The Luftwaffe employed several specific procedures to create deception via radio. First, simulated command function. In this method, a small group of aircraft sent coordinated messages that imitated, in tone and procedure, a large bomber formation, position reports, course updates, fuel status, and thereby created the impression of a much larger formation. Second, diversionary radio bursts. Short, intensive radioactivity in one sector was intended to compel the RAF to concentrate forces there, while the actual attack took place elsewhere. Third, echo communication. The repetition of known codes or call signs that the British interception centers associated with specific bomber units. Fourth, deliberate disruption of expected procedures. For example, English-language announcements with false coordinates, or intentionally misset distress calls, which led to the misallocation of fighter command resources. Not all of these methods are clearly documented in every case. Some were based on improvised field experience and deployed situationally. Nevertheless, documents and reports show that radio deception systems were part of the tactical toolbox.
To understand the effect, it helps to look at numbers and typical force ratios. During large Luftwaffe air raids in 1940 and 1941, bomber units often operated in waves of several dozen to several hundred aircraft. A medium-sized bomber formation could comprise 60 to 150 aircraft. In major attacks, numbers rose slightly into the triple digits. The RAF had hundreds to thousands of fighters nationwide, but they were distributed across sectors and could not be everywhere immediately. A targeted radio deception simulating a group of 100 bombers could cause the RAF to scramble 3 to 6 squadrons, typically 12 to 24 fighters per squadron, in a given enemy air corridor, that is, between 36 and 144 interceptors. If these forces were tied up in the wrong location, the actual attack zone remained exposed or only inadequately covered. Even a few misallocated squadrons could thus enable a breakthrough. Numerically, for a centralized fighter command, which responded in critical moments with 50 to 200 operational fighters, a radio deception could significantly shift the distribution of such units. A characteristic pattern of application was the combination of visual and radio deception. A small formation element produced visible contrails or deliberately created smoke, while at the same time, intensive radio signals simulated a much larger formation approaching. British observers, radar, and radio centers thus received a coherent picture. Radar contacts, visual sightings, and radio traffic, all matched in location and time. In such cases, the reliability of the information chain was crucial. Fighter command could hardly risk ignoring such reports. This type of synchronized deception dramatically increased the probability of success.
Concrete case examples illustrate the tactic. During the Battle of Britain, there were multiple instances where the Luftwaffe conducted small deception attacks while simultaneously carrying out main strikes elsewhere. In a typical example, light destroyer or Bf-110 units flew over the Channel toward southeast England and generated radio contact with air observers there, while heavy Heinkel or Junkers groups attacked far to the west or north. Such diversionary maneuvers drew fighters and interceptor squadrons to the presumed focal point, allowing the main bombing thrust to strike less defended targets. During night raids, the Luftwaffe supplemented these methods with navigation transmitters and jamming devices. The diversionary or decoy radio signals could divert night fighters from their route, thereby reducing defensive effectiveness. Numerous tactical details influenced success. Language was important. English, American, or universally understandable radio messages increased the credibility of a formation from a distance. The Luftwaffe had pilots and radio operators with language skills who were deployed for limited deception broadcasts. The rhythm of the radio messages also followed patterns that Fighter Command recognized from previous encounters: specific intervals, typical communication procedures, call signs, and identifiers. Those who convincingly imitated these patterns increased the chance of deceiving the opponent. Another approach was the deliberate use of radio silence as deception. In some cases, bomber units turned off their radios to avoid early detection. At the same time, communication was deliberately conducted elsewhere to draw attention. This play with silence and noise meant that where there was quiet, a formation could advance almost undisturbed, while at another point the enemy concentrated their forces. From a tactical perspective, this is an elegant form of expectation manipulation. The Allies trusted what they heard and were easily led onto false trails. The effectiveness of such measures depended on several variables. First, technical reliability. Radios had to be operational. Interference from weather, electrical noise, or enemy jammers could ruin plans. Second, the experience of the radio operators. A poor or insecure speaker would trigger enemy alarm. Third, the enemy's information situation. The better the radar and observation network, the less likely it was that radio deception alone would succeed. In the later war phases, as radar, maritime surveillance, and electronic warfare improved, the likelihood of achieving sustained effects solely through radio deception decreased. Nevertheless, combined deceptions, especially in conjunction with visual distractions, remained effective well into 1943. Comparisons with other deception methods highlight the special role of radio. Physical deceptions, dummy airfields, decoys, fires, were visible over time and could be exposed after inspection. Radio deceives the opponent's mental map in real time. It influences decisions, not just perceptions. This makes radio deception potentially more powerful, but also vulnerable to reconnaissance and technical countermeasures. The Allies, in turn, developed procedures for authentication and verification of radio messages to expose deceptions. Codes, immediate confirmation procedures, and cross-checking radar and radio data were prescribed to avoid false alarms. Security and ethics also played a role. The deliberate sending of false distress calls or the simulation of casualties to redirect enemy resources raises moral questions. In combat, pragmatic decisions were made. Deception was considered a legitimate means as long as it did not violate formal rules of war. On the tactical level, however, what mattered was that deception immediately saved lives or caused losses. From a military perspective, radio deception was thus a legitimate, albeit controversial tool employed by both sides.
In assessment, a look at the effects is helpful. Radio deceptions alone rarely decided entire battles, but they could influence individual engagements and casualty distribution. If a defense squadron was misdirected by radio deception, it could allow multiple bomber groups to pass unimpeded, inflicting significant material and psychological damage. At the tactical level, this meant that 10 to 20% of attacking bombers could reach their targets unchallenged because the defense was committed elsewhere, a difference that in specific missions determined success or failure. Finally, some lessons for understanding this aspect of air warfare. First, information warfare is never absolute, but context-dependent. The effectiveness of radio deception depended on technical, personnel, and conceptual factors. Second, deception is most effective when it engages multiple senses simultaneously: radar, visual observation, and radio. Third, advances in defense, such as improved radar processing and advanced procedures for verifying radio messages, reduced effectiveness but did not render the deceptions useless. Finally, historically, The practice of radio deception demonstrates how modern war is fundamentally a struggle over information. Whoever controls the opponent's perception shapes their decisions and, ultimately, the course of operations.